Dr. Halkidis here. He's a professor of applied psychology and public health at Steinhardt School and Population Health at Langone School of Medicine, the director of the Center for Health, Identity, Behavior, and Prevention Study, and associate dean at New York University. So Perry's program of research examines the intersection between the HIV epidemic, drug abuse, and mental health burden in LGBTQ populations. He's well known as one of the U.S. leading experts on substance use and HIV behavioral research. He's going to be here with us tomorrow. He's going to be outside signing his books, and you're going to be around to chat with us. We're very excited. So without any further ado, I ask you to please warmly welcome Dr. Perry. Did I say Peter?
Yeah, but it can be
Perry. I love you, Perry. Halkidis.
Let me start by saying that it's my honor to be here with you. I'm incredibly happy to be at this forum that brings together researchers and frontline staff and activists to think about the issues of HIV that are affecting your country, our country, and many parts of the world. I've been conducting work in HIV for some 20 years, looking at the health of gay men and trying to improve the conditions that gay men face with regard to the HIV epidemic, but also other health epidemics that gay men face. And the work that I'm going to read for you today has resided in my mind for close to a decade. I bring to this work not only the perspective of myself as a faculty person, as a researcher, but also as a long-term survivor of this disease, somebody who became infected in the 1980s. And this last February was grateful and happy to celebrate my 50th birthday. So here I am all these years later. I asked myself about a decade ago, what is it going to be like for the men of my generation, the AIDS generation, as we age? After 1996, sort of the world changed with regard to treatment and survival, and it became clear to me that so many of us were struggling with just living day to day in the 80s and the early 90s and never thinking that we would make it to our 20s, our 30s, our 40s, and now we find ourselves in our 50s and 60s and close to 70s and even 80s for some men. And so this is what the impetus for this book was. And somebody asked me recently in an interview, why didn't I just write my memoir? Which I could have done, but I figured I'd save that when I'm 60 years old. And being a scientist, I always wanted to collect data and reflect voices that are just not my own. So the book is a collection of interviews of 15 men who are long-term survivors, men who came to meet with me and talk to me about their life experiences, share with me their life experiences, and tell me how they've made sense of their lives over the course of the last 30 years. I also wanted to sort of write this book as a historical document because every January I teach a class in London called HIV Prevention and Counseling, and I have lovely 25-year-olds who don't really know what it was like in the 1980s. So lest we forget what that period of our lives was like, I thought it was critically important to write this book. So the book, I think takes readers on a journey. It takes readers on a journey looking at the lives of these 15 men from their childhood, because I think childhood experiences in some ways really inform the strategies that these men developed after they were infected with HIV and how they survived and attacked this disease when there was little hope. And looks at and delineates the strategies for survival that they developed, and then really examines what it means in their lives to be older, HIV-positive gay men, and how they're negotiating this period of their lives after a lifetime of uncertainty. And finally, I think what I really wanted to do was sort of shift the conversation. It is very easy, and we often find that people like me, scientists like me, focus on the problems and the deficit and what's wrong. And in some ways, that's driven by the funding agencies that want us to do that. But I wanted to shift the conversation and say, look, there's also so many things that we did right, and to move the conversation from a model of deficit to a model of resilience. And so the book that came out, that is here today, that is outside there, is a product of a lot of hard work, but a lot of love. And I keep saying to folks that if I never write anything ever again, this would be a perfectly fine, beautiful period at the end of a sentence. So having said that, if you will indulge me, I will just read some of the sections of the book for you. "30 years and counting," chapter 1. "I know no adult life without AIDS. Like the long-term survivors you will come to know in the pages that follow, all of the gay men of my generation, infected or not, are long-term survivors of this disease. We were all affected by AIDS as we emerged into our adult lives, trying to avoid the end product of the pathogen, a termination to our existences in the prime of our lives. Yet like a subset of these men who became infected early in the epidemic and remained vibrant and healthy 30 years later, all of us, my generation, have survived this plague, battle-scarred but resilient, and stronger individually and as a community. It has been said that Americans who served in World War II are the greatest generation. I say that my generation, the generation of gay men who came into their own in the 1970s and 1980s and were decimated by AIDS, are instead the bravest generation. I know it because I lived it. The story of AIDS is not a simple one. In recent years, it has been drilled into our heads that HIV/AIDS is a disease that affects all Americans. Epidemiological trends certainly suggest that the virus has no boundaries and that countless others who are not gay men have become infected. Despite the prevalence of HIV/AIDS in all segments of the population, the epidemic in the United States has always been and still is and will likely continue to be primarily a gay disease. Many, including activist Gabrielle Rotello, have provided multifaceted explanations for why AIDS happened to gay men, and there is sufficient reason to believe that there are myriad biological, medical, behavioral, political, sexual, and social factors at play. But my point here is not why AIDS happened to us, but rather that AIDS did happen to us, a disease that now has affected up to 3 generations of gay men. The story of AIDS and gay men takes many forms. For me, it is primarily the story of Robert Massa, my partner for 6 years, an accomplished writer and journalist who turned his attention from the world of theater to the world of AIDS after he was diagnosed. It is a story of his struggle to remain healthy by ingesting a formulation of lipid extracted from egg yolks, AL721, a holistic treatment many used in the absence of effective antiviral treatments. On road trips, Robert would place his treatment, which was sold in soy sauce plastic packaging and looked like yellow mustard, in a cooler to keep from spoiling. He also wrote in his column for the Village Voice about these therapies that he administered to his weakening body to stay alive: egg yolks and Chinese cucumbers. He was livid about the misinterpretation of the effectiveness of the highly caustic first HIV antiviral treatment, AZT, by the New York Times. Robert died in 1994, 2 years before highly effective therapies might have saved his life. It is also the story of Jim, a man double my age when we met while I was first coming out, who introduced me to the gay scene and who was one of the earliest victims of the epidemic. He suffered in silence as his immune system failed, only to develop lymphoma which ravaged his body before he died in 1986. No one recorded this as an AIDS death, but it was just that. It was all very quiet and concealed. I remember the day he died. It was the day after the Challenger space crew carrying schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe exploded. Americans were shattered by this tragedy. We as gay men were suffering our own disaster silently and with much more circumscribed outcries of love and support. Chapter 2, the men of the AIDS generation. Ralph, one of the men of the AIDS generation who you will come to know in this chapter, described his life living with HIV, including through the darkest moments and times of little hope, as follows. Our experiences write our history, and I think without these experiences, I wouldn't have been or become who I am now. And so, although I didn't really enjoy it, I appreciate it. Between April and June of 2012, interviews were conducted with 15 men, all HIV positive, all gay, ranging in age from 40 to 58, and all long-term survivors of AIDS. The interviews were conducted in my office at NYU, with windows on 2 sides overlooking Washington Square Park to the west, and the Brown Building, the site of the infamous Triangle Shirt Factory fire, to the north. Each year, on the anniversary of that tragic fire, a public health nightmare, a ceremony is conducted, and at the conclusion of this public acknowledgement, a standing arrangement of flowers is placed alongside the plaque on the Brown Building. This annual recognition is a testament to the lives of those, mostly young immigrant women, who perished on that day in 1912. A mile away, The beauty of the 9/11 memorial provides a place of comfort and reflection regarding those who lost their lives on that infamous day. It struck me more than once during the course of these interviews, with the former World Trade Center just south of my office and the Brown Building right across the street, that no true place of mourning exists for those who have lost their lives to the AIDS disaster, although recent efforts have been undertaken to create the AIDS Memorial Park on the grounds of the former St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village. A maroon-like leather sofa was situated on the south side of the office so that each man could look onto the surrounding environment during the course of the interview. I sat in a chair adjacent to the couch with my back to the western windows, and a small table was placed in front of the sofa where we could rest our bottled waters, coffees, and other beverages during the course of the conversation. At first, I had placed a box of tissues on the table, but recognizing the potentially leading nature of the gesture, I placed the tissues on my desk behind my chair and only moved the box to the table during the interviews when there was a need. More often than not, I reached for the tissues. Originally, I had planned to interview only 10 men, but as the interviews were being conducted, I realized the complexity of the task that was in front of me. Because the men with whom I spoke came from all walks of life, from various cultural backgrounds, from diverse means and circumstances, of different sizes and shapes, the stories of their lives as HIV-positive gay men were also widely differing. My instinct was just to speak to more than fewer men, believing that my understanding of these life experiences would be more fully realized from a larger sample. In retrospect, I also believe that my desire to spend time with more of these men was driven by a sense of kinship and connection. My peers, whose life experiences evolved in tandem with my own evolution into middle age. Throughout the interviews, there was an immediate connection and camaraderie with my peers, men of my generation who had lived through the very dark years of the AIDS epidemic. Like me, all were approaching or had emerged into middle age with a lifetime of loss and sorrow. The connection with each of these men was immediate. There was no awkwardness or any sense on the men's parts that I was a dispassionate academic studying a population I knew very little about. Rather, there was a sense that I was one of them, a peer, a brother, a fellow warrior. Ralph expressed this idea clearly to me, saying, "It's interesting that, it's like you can relate to any of this and you're just hearing it. It's great that you're asking me the same stuff that you could probably answer." And he was correct. Often when the men cried during the interviews, so did I. Our experiences and our lives were bonded by the AIDS crisis. Chapter 3, Enter HIV. What should I do? What is there to do? And he, the counselor, basically said, well, you're a relatively healthy guy, you're in shape, but, I'll be honest with you. You'll be lucky if you live to be 30. So just go and enjoy your life and, try to stay as healthy as possible. And I was like, okay, great. When you are 24 years old, you don't expect to hear that you're going to die in a few years. This is how a 50-year-old white gay man who participated in Project Gold, which was the work that I had done prior to doing this study, described the story of his diagnosis in 1984. Prior to 1996 and the development of effective antiretroviral therapy, an AIDS diagnosis or an HIV-positive test result was quite frankly a death sentence. In fact, prior to the identification of the virus in the mid-1980s and the development of the antibody test for detecting the infection shortly thereafter, many gay men became aware that they were living with HIV because of the myriad opportunistic infections they were experiencing. And many of these men died shortly after diagnosis of these AIDS-related complications. By 1985, the year in which the antibody test was developed, and also the year in which the American screen legend and heartthrob Rock Hudson died, some 1,000 other gay men had been diagnosed with AIDS, and close to another 1,000 succumbed to complications of the disease. My friend Jim, who was 38 when we first met in 1981, suffered from ongoing sinus infections and cuts that would not heal properly. The glands in his neck and armpits were regularly swollen, and until he was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in the summer of 1985, he assumed he was just overworked and spent much of the energy trying to combat the fatigue and self-medicate with over-the-counter formulations. By the time of his diagnosis, the cancer had ravaged his body, and within 6 months, and without much help from the chemotherapy and radiation he received, he died in January 1986. At the onset of his symptoms years earlier, no one even assumed he had AIDS. But in the last few days of his life, his HIV infection was obviated by the biohazard warning on the door of his Long Island, New York hospital and the requirement that we wear surgical gowns, masks, and gloves while visiting him. Jim was an early victim of AIDS, although his medical records and death certificate would never show that. Finding out. There is no simple way to characterize what it feels like to be told you're HIV positive. To this day, this revelation results in a complex emotional reaction, as we have found in our National Institutes of Health funded cohort study of young men, Project P18, where we conduct oral antibody testing at each 6-month assessment. Among those for whom antibodies are detected, we obtain a preliminary positive result. Responses to the news are wide and varied, ranging from extremely calm and silent to inconsolable, from completely surprised to expected, and from embarrassed to unabashed. However, the overwhelming response is one of shock. Even with our vast medical advances, which theoretically enable those infected to live a normal life expectancy, the news of a seropositive test result is appalling, even if one knows that he has placed himself in risk's way. I have recently offered to the students in my HIV prevention class a hypothesis that such reactions occur because we are living in the context and culture of the 1980s when it comes to HIV, a reality informed by the fact that we still expect gay men to wear a condom every time, despite clear evidence for close to 3 decades that this message alone is not highly effective. And then middle age. I hope I'd be old before I died. That's what I always wanted, to get older. Like Robbie Williams, like that song says, you know, that British singer. Anyway, that's what I wanted always. Now I'm 50. Those are the words of Johnny when asked about getting older as a gay man and more significantly as an HIV-positive gay man who is a long-term survivor. And so it is for the men of the AIDS generation. In all likelihood, and based on the current state of HIV treatments, many, if not all of the men of the AIDS generation will be old before they die, perhaps living a normal life expectancy, which is approximately age 79 for a 50-year-old man in the United States. The men of the AIDS generation are entering the autumn of their lives, as is the case for all those in middle age. However, for these men, this situation is a reversal of a cycle, because they have already lived through the winters of their lives. Entering middle age is indeed a mixed blessing for many of the men of the AIDS generation. There is evidence of both happiness and awe and of struggle and confusion. For many of the men, there is an obvious negotiation between the good and the bad, the joy and the pain, and ultimately the making of meaning. These are the elements that are further described in the chapter, summarized in part by Kerry's thoughts. I'm not complaining. I'm thrilled to be here. I have all my benefits paid for. I have a place. I have a 13-year younger lover. All my lovers have been negative. They've all remained negative because of safe sex. So I don't want to sound like a downer at all. I just wish the gay community were a little bit more inclusive of us and had more respect for what we've been through. I feel like we're like Vietnam vets. Resilience. If Gone with the Wind has a central theme, I suppose it is this theme of survival. What quality is it that makes some people able to survive catastrophes and others, apparently just as brave and able and strong, go under? I've always been interested in this particular quality in people. We've all seen the same thing happen in the present depression. It happens in every social upheaval, in wars, in panics, in revolutions. It happened all the way down history from the time the barbarians sacked ancient Rome, and before that, I suppose, some people survive disasters. Others do not. Margaret Mitchell, 1936. Never, never, never give up. Hal, 2012. It is December 1st, 2012, as I start this chapter, the 25th commemoration of World AIDS Day. Much has transpired since the first World AIDS in 1987 in terms of understanding, managing, and treating this disease. In fact, television advertisements have been aired for a new at-home HIV test. Still, in 2011, between 31 and 36 million were living with HIV worldwide, 2.5 million of whom were infected that year. And despite the availability of effective treatments, 1.7 million individuals died of AIDS complications in 2011, with 25 million deaths in the last 30 years, according to the World Health Organization. In the United States, which has always been on the forefront in the fight against AIDS, some 40 to 50,000 new infections are detected annually, and gay men experience this health disparity more than any other group, accounting for over 50% of all infections and over 60% in large urban areas like my home, New York City. Sharing strategies for resilience. Recently, I had the opportunity to meet Thomas, a remarkable young man in his 20s who was a student at NYU. An accomplished musician, he is also a gay man living with HIV. My immediate reaction was to take this man under my wing and to protect him. I introduced him to Richard, the musician you have come to know in this volume, with whom we formed an immediate bond. As I think about this young man, I am reminded of another ability of our generation that often goes untapped, that of acting as mentors to a new generation of young gay men also confronting the disease that continues to affect our population. Eddie perfectly understands this role and enacts it with great pride. This, however, remains an untapped opportunity for many of us, those of us who have confronted the disease for decades, working with those who are only beginning their journeys. I raise this issue because I believe that what we have learned over the years and how we have demonstrated our resilience as a generation of men can only help to enhance the life of Thomas and all of those younger men who too are affected by the epidemic. Final thought. In January 2013, as has been the case since 2005, I led an annual pilgrimage to London with graduate students to teach a course on HIV prevention and counseling, cross-cultural comparisons of responses to the epidemic. London has always felt like a home since my first trip there as a very young man and has been an inspirational environment for me. While I was in London, I received a text message from my friend Kelly. The Oscar nominations had just been announced, and How to Survive a Plague had been nominated for Best Documentary. I read the text and smiled, realizing that our lives, the lives of the men of the AIDS generation, were finally receiving the honor and respect that they deserved. In 2012, the pop singer Kelly Clarkson exclaimed, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." We, the men of the AIDS generation, are strong. We are stronger having survived this plague. I stand in awe of the individual and collective resilience and triumphant spirits of these men, and I hope that this book effectively celebrates the stories of the men of the AIDS generation, one of which is my own. Thank you.